The cardiovascular system is well understood today, but the substantial understanding of this system that we have is a relatively recent event. It took thousands of years of work by anatomists, philosophers, and scientists from all over the globe to get the full picture. And it is a recent perspective to view the heart as a purely material and not mystical entity. We know that some of our previous ideas about the cardiovascular system were not only wrong, but downright dangerous. You may have heard of the practice of bloodletting. This is the actually not so ancient practice of draining a portion of a patient's blood in the hopes of curing illnesses. It is well known that George Washington underwent bloodletting just before his death, and the procedure likely hastened his demise. Today we know that the cardiovascular system is vital for the exchange of gases, nutrients, and wastes within our body. Welcome to the voiceover lecture for Chapter 11, the Cardiovascular System, where we explore our current understanding of this important system. I've divided this chapter into 7 sections. In Section 1, we'll cover an overview of the cardiovascular system. In Section 2, we'll view the muscle of the heart in terms of its tissues. Section 3, we'll talk about the anatomy of the heart. In Section 4, we'll cover the cardiac cycle, the flow of blood through the heart and our cardiovascular system. In Section 5, we'll talk about the anatomy of blood vessels. In Section 6, we'll talk about the blood. And finally, in Section 7, we'll talk about our cardiovascular system and some health issues that can arise. Section 1, an overview of the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system can be divided into 3 major parts. The heart, which is the organ that pumps the blood. The blood, which is the tissue that transports wastes, nutrients, and gases throughout our body. And the blood vessels, which are the tubes that carry the blood. Our blood travels through our body in 2 different circuits. First, we have pulmonary circulation. This is where the blood is carried to and from the lungs. The term pulmonary is used to refer to the lungs. Second, we have systemic circulation. This is where the blood travels to the rest of the tissues of our body. The blood vessels in our body are used to transport blood. There are 2 major types of blood vessels. The veins transport blood toward the heart, and they are usually carrying deoxygenated blood, though there are some exceptions. The arteries carry blood away from the heart and are usually carrying oxygenated blood. Again, there are a few exceptions. The cardiovascular system has 3 major functions. First is transportation. The body's tissues need oxygen and nutrients and must get rid of carbon dioxide and wastes. Also, hormones produced by the endocrine system must be transported throughout our bodies. Even heat must be moved around. All of these components are moved in our blood via the cardiovascular system. The second function is regulation. We must maintain a narrow range of pH and temperature to stay alive. And fluid balance refers to maintaining the proper solutes in our blood to control osmosis in and out of our cells. Third is protection. Our blood contains proteins that help in wound healing, and also immune cells and proteins that can destroy pathogens and even cancer. In Section 2, we'll look at the main tissue that's found exclusively in our heart. That's the cardiac muscle tissue. The muscle of our heart is made up of a tissue called myocardium. Remember, the prefix myo means muscle. Myocardium was a striated type muscle tissue. These cells contain many mitochondria. Remember, these are the organelles that produce ATP. Having many mitochondria helps prevent our heart from fatiguing. During development, individual myocardial cells fuse, and the nuclei from those cells are maintained. Thus, many of the myocardial cells have several nuclei. Myocardial cells are often branched, And you can see in the diagram below the structure of myocardial cells. The cells in myocardial tissue are connected directly to one another via cell-cell junctions. Specifically, in myocardium, we have a cell-cell junction known as intercalated discs. These connect the ends of the cells. They represent regions of the plasma membrane that are thicker and contain a special type of junction known as the gap junction. A gap junction is like a protein channel that allows a quick flow of signal molecules between cells. This is important so that we get a simultaneous contraction of all of our myocardial cells. Intercalated discs also contain another type of cell-cell junction known as desmosomes. Desmosomes are Velcro-like proteins that help strengthen and hold together the tissue. Again, here's a diagram showing myocardial cells. You can see these cells are connected end on end, with some of them branching. These darker regions represent where two cells are connected together. Those are the intercalated discs. So it's these regions that contain desmosomes and gap junctions. To the right, you can see real myocardial tissue stained and viewed under a microscope. You can see the dark purple nuclei, kind of oval shaped. And then if you look close, you can see these transverse lines. These dark purple lines, those are the intercalated discs. Intercalated discs are found exclusively in myocardial tissue. This diagram shows a close-up view of an intercalated disc. You can see what's really going on is that the membranes of the two cells are connected with these finger-like projections, helping to increase the surface area and therefore the strength of the connection between the two cells. Within intercalated discs are many desmosomes, represented by these green dots here to the left, and on the right you can see these rosette patterns. Those are the gap junctions. And they're made of proteins with a hole down the middle that allow molecules to move between the cells so that they can communicate with each other and tell each other to contract in nearly simultaneous fashion. Cardiac muscle is found exclusively in the walls of our heart. Remember, there are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle contracts involuntarily. We cannot consciously control the contractions of our heart. Unique to cardiac muscle is that these contractions are controlled by the heart itself. We say that the contraction of our heart muscle is autorhythmic. The resting heartbeat is controlled by a special patch of cells called pacemaker cells. Our heart can continue to beat without any influence from the nervous system. However, the nervous system does modify the rate and strength of our heartbeats. Here's a picture of cardiac muscle viewed under the microscope. Here you can see the nuclei of various myocardial cells. You can see the striations that make cardiac muscle striated muscle. And you can see the darker transverse lines. Those are the intercalated discs. Also in this picture you can see some ruptured blood vessels and red blood cells. In section 3, we'll cover the gross anatomy of the heart. Let's begin with the location of our heart. Our heart's found in our thoracic cavity, or chest. It's found superior to the diaphragm. That's the sheet of muscle that helps us breathe. And the heart is located mostly to the left, so 2/3 of the heart is to the left of our midline. And within the thoracic cavity, the heart's found in the mediastinum. That's the area between the right and left lungs. This diagram shows the position of our heart. You can see it's found within the thoracic cavity. Between the right and left lungs, that's the mediastinum. And it's located just superior to the diaphragm. On the next slide, I'd like to draw out a very simple diagram of the heart. We will label some of the major parts and we'll discuss each part in the context of blood flow. I think diagrams like this are one of the best ways to study something as complex as the heart. It's efficient. You're studying many concepts all in one diagram instead of trying to study each part individually like you do with flashcards. Try drawing and labeling diagrams like this from memory. See how much you can recall without having to look it up. It's a great self-evaluation tool. Also, drawing diagrams provides context. Putting many different parts and ideas together gives you a contextual framework that'll make memorization easier. That's my 2 cents on this study technique, but you don't have to take my word for it. There are several studies demonstrating the effectiveness of drawing as a study technique. Remember, you don't have to be a good artist. My drawings are no better than a doodle, but I still find them helpful anyway. I hope you do too. Begin by drawing a heart shape. You want to leave gaps for your blood vessels. 4 gaps like this. Okay, so that's your basic outline of the heart. Then you want to draw dividing lines that separate the chambers. There's a vertical one that goes all the way through, and a horizontal one that has gaps in it. We'll see later that's for valves. So that's your basic outline. Remember, whenever we draw anatomical structures, unless noted otherwise, the structure is as if you were laying on the page facing yourself. And so that would mean that the left side of the page is actually the right side of the heart, and on the right side of the page is the left side of the heart. And whenever we discuss the blood flow through the heart, we usually, by convention, start with the right atrium. We start with where blood is deoxygenated. So blood's going to come from the various tissues of our body. This little stick man represents our body. So blood is coming from our body, and this blood has already been had the oxygen extracted from it. So it is oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood that comes from the various tissues of our body and enters the first chamber here on the right, which I had already said is the right atrium. The blood vessel carrying blood from the body to the heart is actually several vessels, but they are collectively known as the Vena cava. To keep it simple, I'm just showing one vessel. Technically, it's really 2, a superior and inferior vena cava. I'm kind of merging them together for simplicity. So deoxygenated blood is entering the right atrium. The right atrium's job is to squeeze and push that blood down to this lower chamber here. This chamber is the right ventricle. Blood's going to leave the right ventricle out this blood vessel here. So the right ventricle has to squeeze and push blood out of this blood vessel, and now this blood's going to go to the lungs, where it can pick up oxygen. Here's my drawing of lungs. So blood's going to the lungs, and it's going to pick up oxygen here. So the right ventricle has to squeeze and push blood out all the way to the lungs. So that's going to be under a lot of pressure. We want the blood to only travel in one direction. So there's a one-way valve that prevents blood from flowing back into the right atrium. So here's that valve right here. This valve has 3 flaps or cusps. And so a name for this is the tricuspid valve. The blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart and to the lungs, because it is lung related, they are pulmonary vessels. And because they're carrying blood away from the heart, they are arteries. So these are the pulmonary arteries. Arteries also squeeze and help push blood forward, so they also need one-way valves. And at the base of the pulmonary artery is a one-way valve, and this is the pulmonary valve. Okay, blood has now picked up oxygen from the lungs, and it's going to come back to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. I'm going to redraw the lungs up here. So blood's going to come from the lungs, where it's now oxygenated. I'm going to draw the blood now red to represent oxygenated blood. So oxygenated blood comes from the lungs and enters this upper left chamber, which is the left atrium. Blood from the left atrium is squeezed down into the left ventricle. And the left ventricle has the hardest job. It has to pump the blood, this oxygenated blood, to the rest of the body. Basically every other organ and structure other than the lungs. Again, we need a series of one-way valves to prevent blood from flowing backwards. So there is a valve between the left atrium and ventricle. This one only has 2 flaps or cusps, so it's called the bicuspid valve. It's also known as the mitral valve, named after the headdress that the Pope wears. There's also a one-way valve here at the base of this blood vessel. This vessel is carrying blood again away from the heart, so it is an artery, and it needs to be a very large vessel because it's carrying the blood away from the heart to the rest of the entire body. So this is the largest vessel in our body, and that is the aorta. So the valve at the base of the aorta is the aortic valve. The vessel carrying blood from the lungs to the heart. Remember we talked earlier that vessels that carry blood to the heart are veins. So these are the pulmonary veins. This somewhat messy diagram shows you the major parts of the heart, the major structures, and the blood flow. One thing to note here about the valves is the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are found between atria and ventricles, so they are also known as the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. And then the valves at the base of these arteries leaving the heart, because of the shape of their cusps or flaps, they are called semilunar valves. So sometimes they'll call the aortic valve the semilunar aortic valve, and sometimes they'll call the pulmonary valve the semilunar pulmonary valve. And that'll do it for our diagram of the heart. Now we'll discuss the parts of the heart individually. Let's begin with the chambers. The heart is divided into 4 chambers, as we saw. The right and left atria on top, and the right and left ventricles below. Let's start with the atria. The term atria is plural, and atrium with an M is singular, just to make that clear. And the atria are superior and somewhat posterior to the ventricles. They're set a little bit back. The atria have flap-like extensions that cover the tops. These are called auricles. They can expand and contract to allow more blood into the atria. The atria are the receiving chambers. They receive blood. The next set of chambers are the ventricles. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. They push blood out into circulation. The ventricles are divided by a wall called the interventricular septum. Again, that divides the ventricles. The left ventricle is the largest of all of the chambers, has the thickest wall, the most muscle. And that's because the left ventricle does the most work. Think about it, it has to push the blood to almost the entire body, everywhere except for the lungs. This diagram shows the chambers of the heart. On the left, we have an anterior or front view of the heart. On the right is a posterior back view of the heart. You can see here on the left, the right atrium. This muscular part right here is the right ventricle. You can see a little bit of the left ventricle and left atrium on the front view of the heart. On the posterior view, though, you can see here's the left atrium and the left ventricle, and then the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now let's discuss the exterior anatomy of the heart. The shape of the heart can be represented by an upside-down cone, with a point called the apex pointing downward, and the broader top called the base. The blood that flows through the chambers of the heart doesn't actually provide the heart itself with oxygen or nutrients. So the heart needs its own set of special blood vessels. These are called coronary vessels. The term coronary comes from the term corona, which means crown, because the vessels form a ring around the base of the heart, kind of like a crown. Coronary vessels include coronary arteries, which brings blood to the heart, again bringing oxygenated blood to the heart tissue. Coronary arteries initially branch off of the aorta. The coronary vessels also include coronary veins, which takes blood away from the heart, takes deoxygenated blood away from the heart. The coronary veins merge together and eventually empty into the right atrium. The coronary sulcus is a structure that is a fat-filled depression on the exterior of the heart. It encircles the top of the heart and marks the division between the atria and ventricles. This diagram shows the vessels, the coronary vessels on the heart. Those colored red are the coronary arteries, and those colored blue are coronary veins. Notice again that fat-filled depression that encircles the top of the heart. It's easier to see in the posterior view. That's the coronary sulcus. The heart can be divided into many different layers. Let's begin with the outer coverings that surround the heart. The layers that surround the heart are collectively called the pericardium. And the pericardium is divided into three separate layers. First, the outermost layer is called the fibrous pericardium. Its job is to anchor the heart to the cavity wall. Second is the parietal pericardium. It's the middle layer. Its role is to anchor arteries in place to the heart. And finally, the visceral pericardium is actually part of the heart wall itself. It's also known as the epicardium when you view it as a layer of the heart. The parietal and visceral pericardia are collectively serous membranes. The serous membranes produce serous fluid between those two layers, which allow them to slip past each other, provides lubrication to reduce friction as the heart moves and beats. This diagram shows many of the layers of the heart. Let's focus on the outer layers though. Collectively, the outer layers of the heart again are called pericardia, with the innermost layer being the visceral pericardium, also known as epicardium. Then there's a space filled with serous fluid called the pericardial cavity. And then the second blue line here is the outer serous membrane or middle layer, and that's the parietal pericardium. Finally, the outermost layer here, colored pink, is the fibrous pericardium. Now let's look at the layers that make up the wall of the heart. The wall of the heart is divided into three separate layers. The outermost layer is the epicardium. Remember, this was the innermost serous membrane, so it's also called the visceral pericardium. The middle layer of the heart wall is called myocardium, and that's the muscle layer. It's made up of cardiac muscle, as we discussed in section 2 of this chapter. And the innermost layer is called the endocardium. Remember, endo means inside. The endocardium is a type of endothelium. You might recall from chapter 3 when we discussed the various tissues that endothelium is a type of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So it's a single layer of flattened cells, and this layer comes in contact with the blood. The endocardium of the heart is continuous with the endothelium of blood vessels. Moving on to the internal anatomy of the heart. Within the heart are the valves. The valves are there to provide one-way blood flow. We want the blood to flow in one direction only. The atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, were those that are between the atria and ventricles, as the name implies. The right AV valve is also known as the tricuspid valve. That's because it has three flaps, or cusps. The left AV valve is also called the mitral or bicuspid valve, because it has two cusps. The cusps attach to special tendons called chordae tendineae, or heartstrings. These tendons they attach the cusps to special muscles called papillary muscles. They kind of stick into the heart like little fingers. In this picture, you can see a specific example of an atrioventricular valve, specifically the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve, of course, is on the right side of the heart, between the right atrium and right ventricle. Here, with an actual photo inside the heart, you can see some of the cusps of the tricuspid valve. You can see how they are attached to the finger-like papillary muscle via chordae tendineae, these tendons here. The next set of valves are the semilunar valves. These are found between the ventricles and the arteries that carry blood away from the heart. The aortic semilunar valve is found at the base of the aorta, and the pulmonary semilunar valve is found at the base of the pulmonary arteries. The sounds of the heart are produced by the closing of the various valves. The verbal representation we use for the sound of the heart is lub-dub, lub-dub. The closing of the atrioventricular valves is the first sound, represented by lub. And the closing of the semilunar valves is the second sound, the dub. That means that the atrioventricular valves both close in unison, which is offset from the semilunar valves, and the semilunar valves both close together in unison. Let's listen to the sound of the heart. Here you can see a cross-section cut obliquely through the heart. And through this cross-section you can see the 4 different valves. Here's the right atrioventricular valve, or tricuspid valve, and it has 3 cusps. And then here's the left atrioventricular valve, or bicuspid valve. It has 2 cusps. You can also see the valve at the base of the aorta and pulmonary arteries. That is the aortic valve and pulmonary valve. Notice those 2 valves also have 3 cusps. Here we can see a cool computer animation of the heart beating. You can clearly see the ventricles. You can see the interventricular septum. You can see 2 of the atrioventricular valves. And you can also see 1 of the semilunar valves. This would be the pulmonary valve up here. Notice how the AV valves open and close in unison, which is offset from the semilunar valve. Now let's discuss the four major vessels that arise from the heart. We'll begin with the vena cava. These vessels empty blood into the right atrium. They're carrying deoxygenated blood from the body's tissues to the heart. There are actually two vena cavae. The inferior vena cava brings blood from the lower part of the body up to the right atrium, or the superior vena cava brings blood from the upper half of the body down to the right atrium. In this diagram, you can see the two vena cavae, the superior vena cava on top of the right atrium, and the inferior vena cava below the right atrium. This is an anterior view, and here's a posterior view. The next major vessel is the pulmonary artery. It carries blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. The pulmonary artery begins as one vessel, which is known as the pulmonary trunk. It then splits into two. The right pulmonary artery veers to the right and brings blood to the right lung, where the left pulmonary artery veers to the left and brings blood to the left lung. In this diagram, you can see the pulmonary arteries. Here in the diagram to the left, you can see an anterior view. Notice how the pulmonary artery begins as a solitary pulmonary trunk and then splits into two, the right and left pulmonary arteries. A picture to the right showing the posterior view, you can see again the right and left pulmonary arteries, which will further split into smaller and smaller vessels. Third are the pulmonary veins. These vessels carry blood from the lungs back to the heart, specifically the left atrium. And finally, we have the aorta. This vessel carries blood from the left ventricle out to most of the body. It's the largest artery in the body and the largest vessel in the body. As the aorta leaves the heart, it travels upward. This region of the aorta is called the ascending aorta. You'll notice that the aorta will start to arch to the left, and that region is called the aortic arch. Finally, in this diagram, we can now see the pulmonary veins, which are really only viewable in the posterior diagram to the right here. Again, they're carrying blood back to the heart from the lungs. And then finally, we have the aorta. As the aorta, again, travels upward, that's called the ascending aorta, and then it starts to curve down and to the left. That's called the aortic arch. Here's a picture of a real human heart. This kind of gives you a better sense of the relative sizes of the various parts of the heart. Notice how large the vessels look, especially the aorta, as well as the pulmonary trunk. It's a very large vessel as well. Take a moment to look at the various parts and try to identify them both in a real diagram and a drawing. And that concludes part 1 of our voiceover lecture for chapter 11 on the cardiovascular system. Stay tuned for part 2.